The first sound was not a headline, it was a siren. In the early hours of a quiet morning in Burkina Faso airport, workers looked up to see a low-flying aircraft cutting across the sky. No clearance, no prior contact, no explanation. For a country that has fought so hard to reclaim its airspace and national dignity, an unannounced military plane is not a small matter. It is a warning. And that warning set off a chain of events that has now pulled Nigeria and even Portugal into a story that none of them expected. At first, the public was told not to worry. Nigeria's government quickly stepped forward and assured everyone that the aircraft had simply wandered off course on its way to Portugal. A harmless detour, they said. A routine mission, they insisted. Many people accepted the explanation. After all, when a government speaks about military operations, most citizens want to believe that the truth is being told. But then came the moment that cracked the entire narrative open. Portugal, the country Nigeria claimed to be visiting, announced that it had no record of the flight. No request, no mission, no diplomatic communication. And just like that, the comforting story evaporated. What replaced it was confusion, embarrassment, and a deep sense of betrayal that stretched far beyond West Africa. For Americans watching this from a distance, especially those who remember past decades of government missteps and secrecy, this incident feels eerily familiar. It forces us to ask the same question many Nigerians are now asking themselves: if a government can bend the truth about a military aircraft, what else can it hide? Today's story is not just about a plane. It is about trust, sovereignty, and the dangerous consequences of misinformation at the highest level. If you believe transparency matters, and if you want to understand how this unfolding crisis shapes the future of West Africa, stay with us. Much more lies beneath the surface. Long before the headlines reached international screens, the people who first sensed trouble were the ground staff at the Ouagadougou airport. These were ordinary men and women, baggage handlers, maintenance crews, security officers going about their dawn routines when they spotted the silhouette of a military transport aircraft descending far too low and far too quickly. No scheduled arrival matched that shape. No air traffic controller had received a message. And in a region where airspace violations can easily trigger conflict, their first instinct was fear. Word traveled fast. Within minutes, Burkina Faso's Air Command was alerted and defensive protocols kicked in. The mysterious plane, later identified as a Nigerian military aircraft, was instructed to land immediately. Soldiers surrounded the runway waiting to see who would step out and why they had crossed into Burkina Faso's sovereign skies without permission. For Burkina Faso, a nation rebuilding its sense of security under immense regional pressure, this was not a routine interception. It was a potential breach of trust with a powerful neighbor. When the aircraft finally touched down, the tension only grew. Military personnel aboard were detained for questioning. Their documents did not match any known diplomatic mission. No flight plan had been shared with Burkina Faso. No emergency distress signal had been issued. Everything about the landing felt unplanned and unexplainable. Hours later, Nigeria attempted to provide that explanation. Government officials in Abuja issued a formal statement claiming that the military aircraft had merely made a navigation error while on its way to Portugal. The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed. They expressed regret for the unauthorized crossing, but insisted there was nothing unusual about the mission itself. By presenting the detour as a harmless mistake, Nigerian authorities hoped to calm rising speculation. For a short while, many believed them. After all, unexpected diversions do happen. Instruments fail, coordinates drift. And when a major government assures the public of a straightforward explanation, most people want to give their leaders the benefit of the doubt. News outlets repeated Nigeria's account without question, shaping the early narrative. But Burkina Faso's officials were not satisfied. The behavior of the crew, the lack of documentation, and the absence of any urgency suggested that this was not the kind of emergency landing a pilot makes when fighting failing equipment. Something felt off. And within diplomatic circles in West Africa, quiet conversations had already begun. Was Nigeria hiding the real purpose of the flight? Then came the twist that changed everything. Portugal, supposedly the destination of the aircraft, issued an official denial. Their Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirmed that no Nigerian military aircraft had been scheduled, expected, requested, or authorized. There was no diplomatic mission, no coordination, nothing. This revelation acted like a shockwave through the region. If the Nigerian government had provided the wrong information, the question became why. Was the plane involved in a classified mission? Was it conducting surveillance? Was it transporting individuals or equipment without proper disclosure? Or was it simply a bureaucratic failure covered up with a convenient lie? Burkina Faso, now frustrated by the conflicting stories, found itself drawn deeper into a situation it never asked for. Their officials had acted responsibly in intercepting an unidentified military aircraft. Yet the inconsistencies suggested a far more troubling scenario, a neighbor entering their skies under false pretenses. For a country reinforcing its sovereignty and security posture, this was unacceptable. People across West Africa began to react. The incident became the center of conversations in markets, homes, and public squares. Nigerians questioned why their government had offered a statement that another nation could disprove so easily. Burkinabe citizens wondered what danger might have been avoided or narrowly missed by forcing the aircraft to land. Within just 24 hours, what began as an unexplained landing had transformed into a diplomatic headache, a credibility crisis, and a reminder of how fragile trust can be between nations sharing borders, histories, and tensions. The moment Portugal issued its statement, everything changed. It was not a whisper buried in bureaucratic language. It was a clear, undeniable declaration that carried the weight of a sovereign nation distancing itself from a story that did not belong to them. And when that denial reached West Africa, it felt as though someone had pulled a thread that unraveled the entire fabric of Nigeria's explanation. For many Nigerians, the shock was almost personal. They woke up expecting clarity, hoping their government's words would be confirmed, not contradicted. Elderly veterans who had once served proudly under the Nigerian flag questioned out loud on radio call-in shows how a military operation could be misrepresented so easily. Market women in Abuja and Lagos discussed the news with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for scandal, not statecraft. And younger Nigerians, already skeptical from years of political disappointment, saw the contradiction as yet another crack in a wall of trust that had been weakening for decades. The emotional reaction was immediate because the contradiction was undeniable. Portugal's refusal did not leave room for alternative interpretations. It exposed a government statement as either deeply misinformed or deliberately misleading. And in nations where citizens have lived through civil wars, juntas, and broken promises, truth, especially about military operations, holds a certain sacredness. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the reaction was different, shaped by lived experience and the national mood of vigilance. Since reclaiming control over its territory and redefining its sovereignty, the Burkinabe population had learned to listen to the tone of international events with sharper attention. In cafes and under the shade of roadside trees, people discussed what the false claim might mean. Some felt that Nigeria's misstatement was an act of disrespect, an attempt to minimize the seriousness of violating Burkina Faso's airspace. Others wondered if the plane carried something more troubling, something that could have endangered their country if not intercepted in time. Among Burkina Faso's security forces, there was a sense of vindication. They had trusted their instincts. They had followed protocol. And now Portugal's denial confirmed that their caution was justified. Officers who had stood on the tarmac that morning, unsure whether they were confronting an accident, a misunderstanding, or a covert breach, felt a quiet affirmation. They had prevented a situation that no longer looked like a simple navigational error. Diplomatically, West Africa reacted like a region holding its breath. Officials from neighboring countries, accustomed to the fragile balance of alliances and rivalries, exchanged messages behind closed doors. A violation of airspace is one thing, a false explanation is another. Together, they suggest instability either within Nigeria's command structure or its political strategy. And for a region still recovering from coups, insurgencies, and shifting alliances, instability anywhere can ripple everywhere. International observers also began paying attention. European outlets noted Portugal's swift and decisive communication, a mark of a country intent on protecting its reputation. African analysts connected the incident to broader patterns: the rise of new blocs like the AS, Nigeria's struggle to maintain influence, and the growing impatience of African citizens with opaque governance. Even within Nigeria's military community, whispers began circulating. How could a destination as official as Portugal be listed publicly if it had never been coordinated? Was there a communication breakdown within the high command? Or was the government attempting to shield the public and itself from the true purpose of the mission? Then came the emotional peak of the crisis. It happened not through a political speech, but through the voice of a Nigerian mother interviewed on a local station. Her son served in the Air Force. She said tearfully, "If they can lie about where a plane was going, how can we know where our children truly are?" Her words captured what statistics and official statements could not: the human cost of mistrust. That moment turned a geopolitical misunderstanding into something deeper, a crisis of faith in leadership and a painful reminder of how fragile truth becomes when governments choose convenience over transparency. Long before any government issued a second statement, ordinary citizens across both Nigeria and Burkina Faso were already living with the consequences. In Nigeria, many people felt a familiar heaviness, an unease that comes from realizing that something as serious as a military incident could be mishandled at the highest levels. Conversations in buses, church gatherings, and neighborhood shops all carried the same tone: disappointment mixed with fear. Not fear of Burkina Faso or Portugal, but fear of what it means when your own government bends the truth. For civil society groups, the incident became an immediate rallying point. Lawyers' associations demanded clarity, insisting that if the government could misrepresent a military mission, then it owed the public a full explanation. Transparency advocates echoed the same concern: that trust once broken is hard to rebuild. Their statements were not political attacks, they were reflections of how deeply the truth matters in a nation where so many crises already strained the social fabric. The political repercussions inside Nigeria were just as sharp. Opposition leaders seized on the contradiction, accusing the government of incompetence and deception. They reminded the public that national credibility is not an abstract concept. It is the foundation upon which international cooperation, military alliances, and economic negotiations are built. If Nigeria appeared careless or dishonest, they argued, then every agreement it enters into is weakened before it even begins. Inside the halls of government, the pressure mounted. Officials scrambled to determine how a claim involving a foreign nation could have been made without proper verification. Some blamed miscommunication within the military command, others blamed political aides. But the public saw only one thing: a government that had spoken too quickly, too confidently, and without checking the facts. The fallout with Burkina Faso carried its own weight. For a country like Burkina Faso, now led by a government that places immense value on sovereignty and self-respect, Nigeria's false narrative felt like a dismissal of their right to know who enters their airspace and why. Burkinabe commentators on local radio described the statement from Abuja as a second violation not of land or sky, but of truth. The first violation was physical, the second was moral. This emotional resonance mattered because Burkina Faso is not navigating this moment alone. It is part of a broader shift in West Africa, a push for independence from external pressures, a renewed emphasis on defending national boundaries, and a growing intolerance for disrespect from neighbors or global powers. In such an atmosphere, Nigeria's misstep did not appear accidental. It appeared symbolic, a reminder of old hierarchies the region is increasingly rejecting. The social consequences extended even further. Families of Nigerian military personnel felt exposed. Some wondered whether the government had put their loved ones in harm's way for a mission that was never clearly defined. In Burkina Faso, the public's respect for their own security forces grew after the interception, reinforcing national pride and confidence in leadership. Politically, the incident left Nigeria weakened. A nation that once held unquestioned influence across West Africa now found itself criticized, scrutinized, even ridiculed in some circles. Its attempt to frame the event as a benign navigational error had backfired, deepening suspicion instead of easing it. And in a time when regional alliances are shifting rapidly, especially with the rise of the AES bloc, Nigeria can ill afford to appear unreliable. In the end, the most lasting consequence may not be diplomatic tension or political backlash, but something far more personal: the quiet erosion of trust between citizens and the institutions that claim to serve them. For many Nigerians, that erosion began the moment Portugal said, "We have no record of this flight." And once that crack appears, it rarely stays small. From a distance, the dispute between Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Portugal might seem like a localized misunderstanding, just another diplomatic hiccup on a continent too often overlooked by Western observers. But for Americans who have lived through Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the long public reckoning over government transparency, this story carries a familiar echo. It reflects a universal truth: when a government alters the facts even slightly, the consequences ripple far beyond its borders. In Washington, analysts were quick to interpret the event through the lens of regional security. West Africa is not just a distant geography, it is a critical zone where terrorism, migration pressures, and global competition between the US, China, and Russia intersect. A country like Nigeria, long considered a cornerstone of U.S. engagement in Africa, suddenly appearing unreliable raises concerns that reach far into strategic planning rooms. American diplomats rely on accurate information to shape policy. A misleading statement from a partner nation complicates everything. At think tanks in D.C., the conversation took on an even sharper tone. Scholars pointed out that this was not simply about a plane. It was about credibility, one of the most valuable currencies in diplomacy. Once a government is caught offering information that another nation can disprove, every future statement is scrutinized. And in regions facing instability, the ability to trust official accounts is essential to preventing escalation. For many older Americans, those who remember when official briefings during wartime didn't always match the realities on the ground, this incident stirred an uneasy memory. They understand how misinformation, even when well-intentioned, corrodes the moral contract between a government and its people. They also understand that nations rarely lie without reason. When Nigeria offered Portugal as its explanation, many U.S. analysts quietly asked, if not Portugal, then where was that aircraft really headed, and why didn't Abuja want the world to know? The global reaction also reflected this deeper suspicion. European observers already attentive to rising insecurity in the Sahel viewed the contradiction as a warning sign, evidence that regional powers may be struggling to coordinate honestly. In African diplomatic circles, the incident fueled debates about sovereignty, transparency, and the changing balance of power, especially as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger reorient themselves under the AES alliance. And in this broader context, the leadership of Burkina Faso, especially President Ibrahim Traoré, became part of the conversation. Many outside observers noted that his government's assertive stance on sovereignty and border control contrasted sharply with Nigeria's shifting narrative. For some in the West, Traoré's approach represents a new model emerging in Africa, a leadership style that favors clarity, directness, and a refusal to tolerate ambiguity in matters of national security. Among American seniors watching these developments, the story raises deeper questions about global politics. If a major African power can risk credibility so casually, what does that mean for regional stability? If misinformation in a far-off place can trigger tension between nations, how fragile is the international system we depend on? Ultimately, the incident became more than a West African dispute. It became a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about governance, accountability, and the fragile architecture of trust that binds nations together. For Americans who value transparency and who have lived long enough to know the cost of its absence, this story is not foreign at all. It is a reminder that in every corner of the world, truth remains the first casualty when governments lose their footing. When all the statements have been issued, when the officials return to their desks, and when the journalists pack away their cameras, what remains is something far more fragile than a grounded aircraft the public's trust. And once that trust fractures even slightly, it exposes a deeper truth about how nations rise or stumble in moments of uncertainty. What happened between Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Portugal may appear on the surface to be a diplomatic misstep, but beneath that surface lies a warning that echoes far beyond West Africa. A government that misrepresents the facts about a military operation does more than embarrass itself. It destabilizes the invisible lines of confidence that hold the international system together. And as history has shown from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, once misinformation enters the bloodstream of governance, it is painfully difficult to purge. For the people of Nigeria, the question is now unavoidable. If this was the official story for something as traceable as an aircraft, what happens when the stakes are higher, when lives, borders, or national resources are on the line? And for Burkina Faso, the incident has strengthened an instinct already taking root that sovereignty must be defended not just from foreign threats, but from the carelessness of neighbors who forget the weight of truth. This is where the story widens, touching the conscience of viewers far beyond the continent. For many Americans over 60, the lesson is painfully familiar. You have watched how governments, your own included, have sometimes obscured facts, avoided accountability, or wrapped military actions in narratives that later proved incomplete. You understand how easily a single misstatement can unravel into a crisis of legitimacy. And you know better than most that transparency is not a luxury. It is the cornerstone of peace. As we examine this unfolding episode, one must also consider the evolving leadership emerging in parts of Africa. Figures like President Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso have built movements around sovereignty, directness, and refusing to dilute the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. Whether one agrees with his methods or not, the contrast is impossible to ignore. And it invites an honest question. Is Africa entering a new era where leaders who insist on clarity will shape the future more than those who settle for convenient stories? The incident may fade from headlines, but its implications will not. It challenges us, whether in Washington, Lagos, or Ouagadougou, to rethink what credibility means in an age where misinformation travels faster than aircraft themselves. It reminds us that nations do not collapse from a single lie, but from the accumulation of small distortions that erode public faith over years. So before we close, let me ask you this. Do you believe this moment will push West African leaders toward greater transparency? Or will it deepen the divide between what governments say and what citizens can trust? And do you think leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré represent a path toward rebuilding that trust, or is the world still searching for someone else to carry that responsibility? If these questions resonate with you, please share this video. If you believe that truth matters more than the headlines, subscribe and stay with us as we continue bringing you Africa news that challenges, informs, and reveals the deeper stories shaping our world.